Welcome to a very, very, very important discussion, part one of two, around educational equity, where we're asking, do we have the courage? I am Dr. Charles Cole III, and I'm so honored to be here. I want to thank Families in Action for putting this together in association with Energy Converters. And, you know, it's a crazy time with this pandemic and everything that's happening, but we have a very, very special guest. We have one Derek Mitchell. And Derek, I was looking at your bio, and the bio is big. It's really, really big. So instead of me reading the bio, because people did not show up just for me to read that bio, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are? What's your story, man?
What's my story? That's a great question. I guess the shortest way to describe it is I, just like you, Brother Cole, was a kid for whom our public system didn't necessarily serve very well. But I had an opportunity to learn in one of the most privileged education systems because I tested well as a young mouthy brat. And even in Chicago, where I grew up, my school did everything it can to help and support me. It just wasn't a very rigorous or effective kind of education system. And early in my experience in middle school grades, it was pretty clear and pretty easy to see the educational inequities in Chicago. And I'll tell you one quick story that illustrates it for me. So my principal worked hard to keep me interested, and so kept giving me different projects because I was the kind of kid who, when I got bored, I got into trouble. And one of those projects was a science fair. So she sent me to a science fair at another school on the other side of town. And my mom and I jumped on a bus to get on a train, to get on another bus, to get to this school on Chicago's north side. And when we got there, what I saw was an amazingly beautiful, well-kept, incredibly well-provisioned school. And this school had science labs with, burners and running water and chemicals to, combine to make colors and smoke and all these things. And I experienced this just as a kid who's visiting and wondered the entire time who had made the decision to provision that school and to not provision mine, because we were lucky if we had pen and paper and chalk for the chalkboards. So pretty much from the start of my education, this whole issue of equity was the core, and trying to find places where students are being invested in order for them to reach their potential has pretty much been my life work. And so, from that school, I went to a really privileged boarding school out east, and learned a whole different kind of perspective about schooling, where all of the instruction was super rigorous, but all the expectations were very, very low. I even had a teacher tell me once that it'd be a miracle if I made it through the place. So prove her wrong. Continued, went to undergrad at Pomona College, graduate school at UCLA, got my PhD in educational psychology, and have since been really looking and supporting schools and districts as they try to deliver quality instruction for brats, mouthy kids like the one I used to be.
Man, I think that's beautiful, man. And now you run an organization. What's that organization called? Sure.
I'm the CEO of Partners in School Innovation. And what we basically pour into teachers and leaders who are in the most challenged schools, ourselves being a strategy for school districts to bring about equity in those places. And our work is focused almost exclusively on helping teachers deliver more quality instruction for kids.
That's beautiful, man. And I know you were asking me, and we kind of ran up on time, so I'll say a little bit more about who I am. So I was also born in Chicago. I was born in Maywood, which you are familiar with. I will say that I'm an Oakland boy, but my father and my mother, my father is a Chicago kid, but they went to Proviso East. I'm sure you're aware of that place.
Yep.
And but I moved back and forth. My parents struggled with drugs. I was born in '83, so that late '80s. I think you remember what Chicago was like during that time.
I do.
And so my grandmother lived in Kentucky. She had moved to Kentucky, and I grew up there. and I would go back and forth until she passed. And I ended up in Oakland when I was around 10. When it was all said and done, I went to like 11 elementary schools, many in Oakland. I went to Hawthorne, and then I went to Lafayette, and then I went to Westlake Junior High School, which is now middle. My parents got clean when I was in middle school. I ended up, I played ball in high school, had a few scholarships, but stayed local. And I love hoop. I love hoop a lot, but I stayed local because I knew I wasn't going to the league. Started my career in social work, did that for 5 years, did youth development work, did my MPA, and then, did my doctorate. I worked at Teach for America. I didn't do the core, but I worked as a staff, and I worked in a superintendent's office here in Oakland and did community engagement work at the schools I went to. And then, which was interesting, right? Like going back, and the halls were the same. And sadly, the achievement was the same. Mm-hmm. And yeah, man. And then did my doctorate, like I said, in ed, and started my organization, Energy Converters, which focuses on the end users in education. And I think I'm so blessed to be having this conversation with you because, we're in a time right now, not just with COVID, but even before COVID, Oakland is changing like a lot of places is changing. And we want to have this conversation around courage, like the courage to do what is needed and what is right in education. And so, in this conversation, you and I got 30 minutes together, but we're going to have some fun in these 30 minutes, and we're going to tell these people the truth. You want to do some truth telling with me, brother?
Absolutely.
So let's just jump right into it, man. Like, what does political courage look like in today's education landscape?
Well, you have a really extraordinary example of courage in Oakland right now. In fact, you have a few. And so I'll get to that in a later. First, when we talk about courage, we have to think a little bit about courage to do what, for what end, right? And for me, it centers around the need and willingness to do what's right, to do what's needed, and to do what's hard in the presence of all manner of resistance, right? And there's no place quite like Oakland when it comes to resistance. I mean, we are the gold standard of resistors in this system. And so we have leaders in our school district right now who are masterful when it comes to being able to work hard, focus, and fight through the politics to be able to have the courage to do what's right. Our superintendent's brilliant at that. Brilliant. Just the composure with which she holds herself, her commitment to kids, absolutely critical. Her commitment to kids, and her willingness to hear all sides, right, and see through all of the crazy to what's right for kids and schools, and to actually execute against that. That to me is the most important evidence and definition of courage. But there are a couple of others too, right? There's the courage to do nothing, right? When everybody is telling you to do something and all the somethings aren't the right things to do, right? There's the courage to hold the line on a decision when you're getting a lot of people angry and upset about a decision. You can think of closing schools as an example of that kind of decision. And so we're not. I don't think we're at a dearth in Oakland of political will and courage, right? I think our gaps are different.
Right.
Right.
I want to even add on to that, and I do want to show love to our superintendent, Kyla, who I worked with before she was a soup, and I consider her a friend. I think she's one of the most brilliant people I know. I think that, I just want to show love to the folks that are on our school board that are still trying to do work during this time, which is a crazy, unprecedented time. Like, we've never seen this. And somebody that I work with in the healthcare side of things, they said something which was really interesting. They said that we're living in 3 time periods at once right now. We're living in a major plague, which we've had in the country, but it was by itself. We're living in a moment of racial unrest in a way that we've not seen it in a while. And we're living in a time of resistance. And we're living in all 3 of those at the exact same time, which is something that's very new.
I'll offer you a fourth.
Okay.
We're also living, on the edge of a financial crisis.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And we know what happens when those happen. Right. Who tightens their belts or who are forced to give up stuff first? when we hit a financial crisis. It's the families with the least.
Right.
Right. And so all four of those pandemics, if you will, are shaping the landscape that we're currently operating in. And frankly, there's not a lot of political will above our systems that are willing to kind of block and tackle for us.
Right. Right. And I mean, and let's you said you wanted to see hints of the Chicago and the Oakland mashup. When we on this topic of courage, I remember being a young social worker, and I had an opportunity, and I was kind of nervous about it. And my dad was like, what's up? Like, you good? And I was like, man, I'm nervous about this thing. And he was like, well, is anybody gonna beat your ass? And I said, well, no. And he was like, what you worried about?
Chicago dad.
And he was like, and he said, well, what you worried about? And I've carried that with me in Oakland education and my education work, both here in Oakland, Chicago, and nationally, where it's a school board meeting. It's just some people yelling behind a podium. It's some folks that didn't grow up here sometimes, that don't understand what our kids are going through, don't understand, or got their own issues or whatever, or maybe they right or whatever, but I've never been afraid to do the academic and educational work in my city. And if we're talking about what does political courage look like in today's education landscape, I would offer up my daddy's advice. If somebody not going to put their hands on you, and that fear is keeping us from doing what is right for kids in a city that needs it. When I say I went to 11 schools and lived in 4 shelters, and the things that I've seen, the type of violence that I've seen, and oh yeah, by the way, I graduated with a good GPA, but was still remedial everything in college. Something is broken there. Right. So are we going to let mean Twitter and Facebook messages scare us off? Or are we going to do what we know is needed to do? So that's courtesy of Charles Levon Cole Jr. I'm the third. So
absolutely. Well, let's talk a little bit about why those are the conditions in which you went to school. Because that triggers the real issue of why we're in a position where our leaders have to demonstrate the kind of courage we're talking about. The first is consider the difference in per pupil spending between New York and California. Right now, do you think Californians love their kids half as much as New Yorkers do?
I think they love their kids just as much as those people do.
Do you think Californians believe in their kids half as much as New Yorkers do?
I would hope we believe in our kids just as much.
Maybe the issue is New Yorkers pay their teachers more. Nope. California pays their teachers $1,000 more than New York pays their teachers. Yet New York per pupil spending is $23,000 a year. Californians is 13. All in. Think about that, right? So think about it. The biggest expense are the people, right? And California is spending more on the people, the teachers, the ones who matter most, right? But New York schools have more resources which to do more work, to provide more support, to double and triple and quadruple the kind of coaching, the kind of teacher professional development, the kind of wraparound services for kids than what California has. And so when you look at the differences in performance, it has a lot to do with resourcing, right?
I mean, yeah.
And so who has the political will to challenge that assumption, to challenge that problem? Because trust me, the principals around Oakland could do a whole lot, right? With double the amount of money that their current teachers cost in each building to deliver on better outcomes for kids.
You know what I've seen, both as a student. So I was a student here when Ebonics was a thing. I was a part of that test group. I was in middle school. I was also a student. It was close around that same time we had one of the biggest strikes we've ever had here in Oakland. Yep. And I think about our history, and you talk about those things. One of the things that I've seen, though, if I'm being honest, is we don't give things enough time to actually see through fruition, right? So we'll set a plan, a superintendent will set a plan, and then like after a year or two, somebody will switch it up or they'll abandon it and there'll be a new plan. So we actually don't really know what might actually work here, because the political will to see things through when things get a little tense, it's always been tough. And you can't retain good superintendents if you're talking about marching on their house, which is what was happening with the Black woman who grew up in Oakland, that loves Oakland. There are people that are plotting and planning to march to her home where her children are.
Right.
Like this is an issue. Like in the city, and you can talk about charters or whatever. You can talk about all this stuff. I was going to school here before charters was like a prominent thing. Mm-hmm. And the school still was not doing what it needed by me. And you can blame all this stuff. You can talk about everything, but that is what happened to all of us in my generation in those schools and before me and after is violence. That was violence against us in a city where most of us can't even afford to live anymore. Like I want to buy a home in Oakland where I grew up, but it's almost impossible, right? And
but Charles, understand though, the violence you're talking about is a trailing indicator, right? Mm-hmm. This is the end of a long, sort of chain of racist decisions that disinvested in communities of color over decades, mm-hmm. right? That forced Black families to only live in places where the water is bad and the air is bad. I mean, literally, we're talking about a very long, very old, very stagnant set of decisions and structures that we're trying to get out from under. And honestly, another definition of courage is the ability to kind of leverage these multiple crises to actually, borrow a line from Joe Biden's campaign to build back better, right? Mm-hmm. Because to me, the biggest tragedy would be if we take all of these challenges and all of these problems and all of the opportunity that's inherent in the current situation we're in now and only reproduce what we had in the past, right?
I think that's a great point. And Derek, and I'm going to move us forward because I think we're in the midst of a huge election, not just for the president, which is huge, but also for our local school board. We got 4 seats that's up. This is a critical election, right?
Right.
And again, if we're talking about this, do we have the courage to do the things that's right? One, you got to go out there and vote. We're not going to talk about who the candidates are in this forum or whatnot. Nope. But you have to go out and you have to be active and vote. But that brings me to my next question, because you've been doing this work and you've been doing it with the more courage. So what are some of the obstacles that you face in leading this work?
Yeah. Well, you've mentioned one already, the perpetual Groundhog Day that happens when there's a leadership transition inside these systems, right? And, a new leader comes in and wants to rip out anything that smells like the leader that was there before them. And it's a huge problem because the memory of these systems and the commitment to the kind of time that the schools have to actually deliver on outcomes requires persistence, requires time, requires consistent investment over a long period of time. Mm-hmm. And it's hard to sustain that when you have district leaders who are flipping, every 3 or 4 years. And so one real critical factor is we've got an amazing opportunity with our current school district leader, right? This is not someone who's looking for her next, big move, right? Mm-hmm. She is Oakland through and through. She's populated every level of the system and understands it from the inside out, and is committed to it being better and better and better. And so we have an opportunity now to have what Boston had, a superintendent who's here for 10 years and able to see a reform from its inception all the way through. And I think we need to lean into that opportunity going forward. So leadership transition is one of the biggest challenges. You can get very far at a school or in a district, but the moment there's a change in leadership, pretty much the ground tends to fall out from under whatever strategy and reforms you were executing against.
Man, go ahead, keep going.
Another challenge really is the challenge I alluded to around resources, right? And so we work in our schools and our districts that are most challenged, right? They have least, and they have the students who have furthest to go, right? But in the presence of those contexts, I like to think about them as places that actually exist in the aura of asset, because the actual facility and the resources within it and the commitment of the people to it is in a constant state of erosion, right? Teachers are coming and going. Sometimes you have books, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you have computers and then they get stolen. I mean, it just keeps happening, right? And so it takes a leader who's able to execute effectively within the confines of a challenging platform, right? Where they're stable one week and super unstable to next. So there's a lot of skill building in relationship to that. And so building leadership matters too. And the stability of that leadership is really critical to help schools get better over longer periods of time. The last challenge that I would mention really has to do with expectations, right? And so I spend a lot of my time talking to folks who have a lot of money, because my job is raising money to provide support to these sets of schools through my organization. And a lot of times what they say are things like, "Oh, darling Derek, it's a miracle when one of you makes something of yourselves." Right? A direct quote from a Google billionaire, by the way. And bless her heart. I said, "You know what, ma'am? It's not as rare as you might think." But that illustrates the kind of expectations folks have for kids coming out of the communities that we're talking about, right? The expectations are so low, and students know they're not stupid, right? They can hear you, they can see you, they will rise to your expectations, be they high or be they low. And so helping people maintain high expectations of what kids are capable of is a real critical challenge in this work.
Fam, let me tell you about these low expectations. I remember being a student at Lafayette, and because I lived in a shelter, this is when they used to give out the bus tickets, and they would give you tickets if you qualified. And I remember getting the bus tickets, and I was grabbing it, and the ladies behind the counter were just like, one of them said to the other one, "Why you spend so much time investing in little thugs in training?" I'm there. I'm in the 5th grade, right? I'm a 5th grader. You know what I'm saying? And it's like, yeah, man, when you look back and you think about what they think of us, I live in Oakland. I'm from Oakland, California. I'm from the home of the Panthers. Huey P. Newton went to that same school. And you know what Huey P. Newton also did? He didn't let nobody else that he loved go to that school. They built their own. And I think that one of the things, like, we have to start having honest conversations. I don't care about the politics. I don't care about saying the wrong thing. See, we so worried about saying the wrong thing and people not liking us and Twitter not liking us and Facebook not liking us and not being favorites, that we are doing another disservice to another generation of kids. And this whole series is about having the courage to do what's right. I want to represent for my city, and our city, which is now one of the shining bright spots of the world. You understand? Oakland is one of the fastest growing cities in the world. It's one of the hardest to move into and to stay in. And we have to really stand up for our people. So I want people to know there is a very important election, and we need folks to stand up and you need to kind of read for yourself too. Don't listen to what this camp is putting out or just what that camp is putting out. Start looking at how these schools are performing. Look at what is actually happening to your child, because let me tell you one other thing. I'm going to take the full screen for this one, Derek. Let me say one other thing on this, man, because there are a lot of people making decisions about what should and should not happen in our schools, or blocking things that can make our schools better, when they will never, ever, ever put their kid next to your kid in that school. It just will not happen. Because if the white schools were treated and ran like the black and the brown schools, they would have burned this whole system down. And it would have happened. And so I just wanted to.
But Charles, those things aren't accidents, right?
Absolutely not.
It's not an accident that they're not in the same school, right? It's not an accident that segregation is worse now than it was in the 60s. Mm-hmm. We haven't actually tackled the real underlying problems. We haven't. And it's really about whose kids are worth investing in. That's what it boils down to. It boils down to whose kids are worth investing in. California in 1980 was in the top 10, right, in terms of per student allocation. Now it's something like 38th, right? Mm-hmm. And so our society here has decided that our kids, miraculously, just aren't worth investing in. And the fact that we are predominantly kids of color now is just coincidental, right?
I mean, the funny thing is that we flipped. When I was at Lafayette and Westlake, it was actually a majority Black district. It is now a majority Latino district, and we are bleeding Black kids more and more because of just the dynamics of the city. But let me just also clarify this for people. If a neighboring country, let's say if it was an antagonistic country, said, I'm gonna make sure that only 3 out of 10 of all your kids can read, I promise you we dropping the bomb tomorrow. I'm telling you, any president, Republican, Democrat, whatever, is dropping the bomb tomorrow.
Let's hope they wouldn't drop a bomb, Brother Cole, because that'll end up backfiring on us. But yeah, there'd probably be war.
If another country said that we're gonna make sure only 3 out of 10 of your kids can read, that is a war crime. But in California, 3 out of 10 Black kids are reading on grade level. See, we can talk about all this other stuff. We can talk about who said what and how they sounded or whatever the case is. But when we look at the hard facts, and it's not that much better for Latinx students, and it's just, it should be a bigger problem than what it is. And this is the moment where we actually need to be coming together to figure these things out for our kids, as opposed to stroking our own adult egos.
Well, there's huge opportunity now. I mean, there's nothing like leveraging a crisis to bring about real change. And I think we have the district leadership that could make that happen. It's just really a question of whether we all show up and vote for the folks who are going to support the direction of the leaders and the systems right now to get the work done that we need to get done. I think we can. For me, I would say what you said a bit more proactively, Brother Charles Cole. I would say that we've been attempting to succeed as a society with one hand tied behind our back, hopping on one foot. And that was fine for a while because we weren't facing Mike Tyson. But we're facing Mike Tyson right now. We need both our arms and all the footwork we can muster right now. And that means every kid needs to meet their potential, every single one, regardless of what they look like or how much money their families have or what language they speak or where they come from. Every single kid in our system has to meet their potential for us to remain a society that we want to live in and that we all aspire to. And so if we create these structures that lock, 70% of the kids out of high achievement, we will never become the society that we aspire to be. Then that's Democrat, Republican, and everybody in between, right? What is wrong with every kid being able to read and compute and make great decisions and think for themselves? Nothing's wrong with that.
Well, there's something wrong with it, and slave owners knew about it, and they said anybody that can read is not worthy of being a slave. So with that being said, and with the treatment that we've shown and highlighted for our Black, brown, poor kids and other kids, it is a bunch of groups that are represented there. The golden rule in television and any of this stuff is leave the people wanting more. We are at our time, but thank you so much, Dr. Derek Mitchell, and I hope that we can engage in this type of conversation again. On behalf of Energy Converters and Families in Action, I am Charles Cole. Thank you so much for spending some of your evening with us. And please join us again tomorrow for part 2 of this conversation, where we will be having one John King, and it's going to be great. It's going to be glorious. You all have a blessed night. And again, what's holding you back? Where does your courage come from? And be the advocate that you wish you had when you were a child. We're out.